I'm going to issue the immortal words because we're going to live stream. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going live. That means that hopefully people are joining us both in terms of our audience here at the college, our audience online, and those people who will be watching it in the future as a recording. So delighted that you're here with us, both virtually and in the flesh. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Sacha, who is the Chief Executive of Amnesty International here in the UK. This is the beginning of a partnership between CityLit and Amnesty, and it's a wonderful way of kicking off that partnership. Huge amount of work has been done by the Amnesty team and also Martin and Maria here at CityLit to create a holistic curriculum that will flow out during the rest of this academic year. Today is important because it is the last day of the 75th year of the Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And we thought that that was a very good springboard to reflect on what has happened and also to look forward about the challenges and the opportunities that are facing us in the world and Amnesty itself. So that's where we're going to go over the next 50 minutes. It's a chance for Sacha to tell us a few of his thoughts and also for us to really kind of reflect on our place as a premier academic institution here in the UK with a huge commitment to social and liberal values and education, because education plays a pivotal part in human rights, and that's why I think this partnership is very important. But Sacha, before we go on, I have a pathological hatred of reading other people's CVs out because I always feel as if I'm not doing them service. You've got a fascinating kind of background before you came to Amnesty, and I'd just like you to, in your own words, tell us a little bit about you and how you came to kind of have your role at Amnesty.
Well, thanks so much. Thank you for having me today, and we're really excited about the partnership ourselves. So I think, like lots of people, my career has not necessarily gone in the direction that I thought it would initially, but you end up in the place that you wanted to end up. So I first studied politics and international relations, and you might think, oh, well, that sounds very linear to where you are now. But actually, for a long time between that point and now, I was doing a whole mixture of different things, including about 15 years or so ago studying law while I was working full-time. That was a kind of fascinating experience. Again, I really hoped when I did that to go perhaps more directly into rights-based work, and I assumed that that's where I'd get the real ace the marks in that law degree. Funny enough, I got my highest marks in that law degree in land law and in equity and trusts, which is will writing and probate. And someone very enthusiastically said, "So is that going to be your career?" And I thought, well, no, that's not quite where I want. Brilliant areas as they are, but it was a journey, and I suppose the takeout I would say from that is that the commonality I realised was that I went into campaigning, and I actually started with a focus on child rights. And actually very specifically a focus on supporting children who had been forced into child soldiery. So that was my kind of journey into more practically applying rights. And that developed over a few different roles, including before my time at Amnesty at a charity called War Child and at UNICEF. But for the last 3.5, 4 years or so, I've been working across the range of human rights in Amnesty. So it's a bit of a circle of a journey back to perhaps what I hoped for when I started.
Yeah, the loss of the conveyancing profession is the gain of the human rights one. Tell us a little bit about how you actually see the role of Chief Exec of Amnesty. What does the overarching role, and then what does a kind of a day look like, if there's such a thing as an average day?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that Amnesty around the whole world is an organisation of about 7,000 or so people who work for Amnesty, and about 10 million or so people around the whole world who are supporters and members of the Amnesty family. So I really want to emphasise that the role of being chief executive in the UK is very much one of all of those 7,000 people who work there, and even one of the kind of 10 million who are involved in the movement more broadly. But in that Amnesty family, we have around 70 national organisations. We call them sections. Slightly way that you have your own language. I know that an academic institution will have it too. We have around 70 or so of those sections, of which the UK is one. That's quite a lot like other NGOs, not non-governmental organisations around the world. The only difference, I'd say, to perhaps some of the areas I worked before in emergency aid and development, where I'd worked before, is that sometimes governments are not keen for there to be an amnesty working in your country, and that can mean we have to close a section sometimes. So that number I said of 70 would have been a little bit higher when we had our Hong Kong section. Sadly, we had to close that on security and safety grounds for the colleagues involved, which is not something we like to do. But my role is leading Amnesty here in the UK, and our job here in the UK is to work here on everything that Amnesty is working on around the world, talking to the UK public, talking to the UK media, and obviously talking to the UK government about all of the foreign policy issues around the world. But then very significantly as well, we're responsible for trying to make better the human rights situation here in the UK. And maybe over the course of the hour we can talk a little bit more about that, because that's an important part of our work as well. And that's really through our model, our theory of change, as we might call it, is evidence-based campaigning. So strong evidence analysis research on human rights situations everywhere in the world, and then trying to do something with that research to change things for the better. But we also strongly believe that it shouldn't just be us alone doing that, but actually that human rights change comes from thousands and thousands of people working on the issues that matter to them, campaigning on the issues that matter to them, understanding human rights well in their own work. So a big part of what the team in Amnesty UK delivers is training and education, human rights education, so that people who care about human rights issues are able to take that knowledge and work and campaign alongside us, or as part of our campaigns as well. There isn't really a typical day in my job, but there's some typical ingredients over a period anyway. Obviously a big part of what you're doing when you're running an organisation is helping to run that organisation, but perhaps slightly unusually in my job compared to some others, I will be, if I use tomorrow as an example, in the morning I'll be outside the Home Office, where we are campaigning on against some of the big changes that have happened in the last couple of years, restricting the right to protest and freedom of expression here in the UK. I might be on TV talking about something that's very much in the news, the human rights situation in Syria, which Amnesty has obviously been working on for a number of years, and it's a very live situation right now. And before the week is out, I might be giving evidence in the UK Parliament with some of our evidence, some of our research. So those are perhaps some of the things that are a little bit unusual, but I'm very much one of those 7,000 people rather than anything else in the Amnesty family.
That's a really good insight into the organisation, because I think a lot of us know it from the outside. It does lots of very good work, but it's how does it work? How does the federated nature of it work? And also the duality between, particularly being in a Western democracy, the work that you do highlighting work outside our country, but also the work you do within our country as well, and ensuring that there's work and coverage here of things that we're not getting as right as we could be. Let's go back to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So coming on now for 76 years ago, yes. It was launched to the world in the aftermath of the Second World War, in a very, very different world than now. Yes. It was a differently dark world, I would say. Our world at the moment has a lot of challenges. The world then had a lot of challenges. So tell us about the origins, tell us about that kind of initial period and why there was suddenly this kind of flag in the ground to say that human rights mattered.
So 1948, the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was clearly only a few years after the true horrors of the Second World War had become visible and understood. But the origins of that declaration actually developed during the Second World War itself, and there are a few things that are very notable about that declaration, and perhaps help to contextualise why it was the first of a new step rather than something only of its own era of the 1940s, because the thinking behind it had very much developed through the Second World War, number of different sources, but the creation of it was in Paris in 1948 at a meeting chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, actually, and that particular meeting and the creation of the Universal Declaration and the vote of the Universal Declaration was the third vote of the UN General Assembly. So in terms of the international frameworks that govern not just human rights, but anything to do with international law in the way that we think it's currently protected, the role of the UN, this was all very fresh, very, very new at that particular time. What was really notable about that declaration was not just its scope and breadth. It's got about 30 articles within it, and they cross still very, very relevant and still quite broad areas of human rights. A very far forward thinking and far-reaching a document across those 30 articles. But I think what's really notable about it was there was a real step change in terms of the approach and therefore the language and the scope. Prior to that document, prior to the thinking, prior to 1948, you really would have seen anything that tried to approach the world after a war as very much, I think, victor's spoils, and very much about the political context and the political aims of the winners in that war. And you would have seen anything that was a treaty, anything that was approach that followed afterwards, being very much in that context. This was really the first time that you saw something say, no, what we're talking about is a universality. We're talking about a universality of rights. We're going to be talking about those not as the rights or what's been earned by whichever countries happen to win that previous conflict. We're going to talk about those as the inalienable rights of everyone, regardless of where they are on the planet, regardless of what their particular backgrounds can be. This was a landmark step forward. Now we look back, and obviously since that time, the Universal Declaration, which I should say, by the way, if any of you don't know this, is the most translated document into the most languages in the world in human history. We now look back, and because that and the approach that's flowed from it, and actually some of the detail that's taken that declaration into further detail and further standing in law in terms of treaties, that approach now seems like something we're quite familiar with. The concept that you're actually saying this is what a person, wherever they may be on the planet, deserves. As we're now so familiar with it, I think you can sometimes perhaps not recognise what a massive step change, what a massive achievement that was on the part of the people that created it. Since that time, what we've seen is the principles that are set out and the aims and the objectives set out in those different articles in a number of areas, given stronger powers and enforcement in law and actually greater depth, because they've been turned into subsequent conventions and treaties that give greater force to the declaration. But the one thing I'd say as we approach the end of the sort of 75th year of looking back is that that landmark moment, I think, really was a forward-looking moment. I'd challenge anyone to look at any of the articles in the declaration and say, that looks out of date. I think, rightly, some people might say, I'm looking at that, it's very, very relevant. How do we make sure it stays relevant, or how do we want to deepen it as we look to the next 50 years? And perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that in this conversation. But its timeliness is still as fresh today as it was in 1948, even though actually I think also looking forward there might be some areas that we want to strengthen and keep building in the same way that those treaties have done since 1948.
The use of the word declaration as opposed to a treaty, as opposed to a convention, etc., was there a particular significance of why it was that at that point, and it kind of set the tone?
It's a very good question. As I said, in 1948 it was a very fresh new phase of international law, and so there's actually been, and sort of the lawyers and the people studying legal related courses here will probably be very excited about the detail of this, but there's been quite a lot of jurisprudence that's developed since the Universal Declaration about its actual standing of the Declaration itself. But put in the simplest terms, a declaration doesn't automatically become law, but guides a number of legal principles. However, since that time, since 1948, there are a wide range of countries that have actually incorporated the declaration into their own constitutions. Cambodia, Portugal, Romania, many other countries other than those three, but that just sort of gives you a sense of the geographic range. Even where countries haven't quite done that, such as India, obviously country within whose borders the largest single share of the global population lives, the Indian Constitutional Supreme Court has said that the Universal Declaration, it's actually acknowledged that as fundamental guiding principles for the Indian Constitution itself. And of the 193 or so countries where you could look for the application of the Universal Declaration, 193 have incorporated at least one of kind of 4 critical treaties into their own law afterwards, and obviously many have incorporated multiple. So the fact it was a declaration, the fact that it set out a sense of universal principles and universal guidance, and then in and of itself, you could say, fine, there might have been a moment after that declaration where it long got forgotten. The opposite has happened. It's recognised in and of itself as being a guiding aim around international law and principles, even if the document itself does not stand with the full status of a treaty. What's happened since, though, in a number of the areas that you would want to see happen, is that treaties have followed, which mean that and treaties have a particular standing in law, both internationally and also for the countries that become signatories to them, including the UK. So it's been built on as a kind of canon of law much farther and deeper and with much more strength than just the declaration itself.
So I'm just thinking about 1948, and 1948 was a pretty nasty year. Berlin airlift, the real flexing of muscles between the Soviet Union and the United States. You have India and Pakistan having their independence and millions of people dying and then being made refugees. You have the first Arab-Israeli war. You have all of that going on. It didn't feel like a punch to the air, this is a really good time to be going about the nice stuff. How did it get past the fact that you were going to a bipolar world between the Soviet Union? Because I can't imagine Stalin, who's doing all his shenanigans in Eastern Europe at that point, is going, yeah, human rights, that's top of my list.
Well, I think that perhaps the will and the strength and the skill of some of the people involved in its creation and in those debates at the Paris conference shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, not least of all the chair, Eleanor Roosevelt, who I'm sure was both an intellectual and force of nature at the conference from all accounts, but not solo. You're right in terms of the context of what was happening in the world in 1948. I mean, 1958, 1968, 1978, looking to today, there's never a period in the whole of that span when there's been a completely calm period. But what it wasn't was perhaps a period like, if you look back to the early 90s when broadly things were being created in an overall environment of optimism. Yeah. It wasn't that in 48. My own family were fleeing during the Indian partition in 48. Yeah. Actually, they didn't flee in 47, they fled in 48. So just one of the examples that you talk about is quite personal to me and my family. If you look back at the debates around 48, some of that skill of the Universal Declaration being passed, it's worth acknowledging that there were some ambitions for it to be further and deeper in some areas, and it couldn't get consensus. Some of the areas about freedom of political rights did see more opposition from the Soviet Union, as was. Some of the areas about other rights did see more opposition from what were still very strong colonial powers that perhaps even in 48 had ambitions to stay as strong colonial powers. History perhaps showed that differently, but at that particular point, things had not moved on quite as much. So it wasn't just Stalin or one country or the Soviet Union that were in any way blockers to some of the breadth that we may have seen in the declaration. But having said that, again, if you look at those 30 articles, it's not that some of them now we don't look back on and we think we would, if we had a time machine, have wanted to strengthen the wording even the declaration. I'll give you one example. It wasn't necessarily sort of geopolitical in that context. It's more kind of question of time. A number of us think that the articles relating to the right to family, if you look back on, we would have wanted to be more clear that that was really a right to love and a right to your choice as to who to love. But back in 1948, I'm not sure anyone, whether they're from the Soviet Union or the UK, who had power at that time, was necessarily thinking in those terms. Even if obviously since, in a number of countries, including this country, the way in which we interpret that right has moved very much more to the way that I've phrased it. So it's not that it was only the geopolitics. Of course, some things were the context of the time, but you're absolutely right that there were forces that would have happily brought down the entire idea. There were also, I think, perhaps still, maybe even in the geopolitics, enough memory of what was recent history that people for different reasons saw this as important. And then some very skillful people, including Eleanor Roosevelt, wanted to see this delivered into the international frameworks going forward as well.
So play it forward a little bit. Decade or so later, Amnesty is founded. Tell us why Amnesty came about. What was the perceived need? How was it envisaged, and the growth of it since those days?
So it was the early 60s that Amnesty was founded. So about 15 years or so after the Universal Declaration. It started originally. It's founded in the UK. It was founded by a guy called Peter Benenson. And it was founded because Peter Benenson, who actually didn't pass away until much after that, but the earlier part of this century. I never got to meet them personally, sadly, before my time in Amnesty. But one day he read an article in the Observer newspaper, which again in recent news has been a subject of debate, the future of the Observer. But anyway, was obviously a big broadsheet newspaper at the time. He read an article about the imprisonment of some young people in Portugal who had, in a very low-key way actually, but been kind of expressing support for workers' rights. And they'd been imprisoned. And he felt that he shouldn't just read that article, but there should be something that people should do about that. And he sort of started up an approach, which is still one of the things that Amnesty does, although we do much broader work than this now. But essentially, a letter writing, campaigning approach. And he was doing that, and Amnesty began doing that on behalf of people who were unfairly imprisoned. And that is still a part of what Amnesty exists to campaign on, and it is still an area of terrible human rights violations that we see around the world. People who are unfairly imprisoned, including very, very frequently, they're unfairly, improperly imprisoned because they are fighting for other people's rights. It's one of the major areas. It's sometimes unfair imprisonment can be purely capricious, but usually autocratic states are not completely disorganized. They are trying to target the people who are opposed to the autocratic state and want to fight for freedoms. And obviously we're seeing some of that right now in the news in Syria, which was one of many countries in the world where that was very much practiced. So that's how Amnesty began, really on the issue of unfair or improper imprisonment. Over the period, over 70 years roughly or so since Amnesty's creation, over that time the organisation was able to develop depth and breadth. And now what we are is an organisation that works on the full range of human rights issues. Everything still derives from the Universal Declaration and all of the subsequent treaties and conventions that flow from it, but we will work right across the range, and our approach is evidence-based campaigning for change and helping people to campaign on the human rights issues that really matter to them, which is, and the method of that latter part being, if you don't understand those human rights issues, You might not even recognise your own rights, so hence why we think human rights education is so important, and not just as a standalone, but its incorporation into a whole range of study subjects, because human rights is so interweaved, and also, you know, helping people to have the strength and the confidence and know that there's the backup for them campaigning as well. So it's got a lot broader over that period, but it began very much with something that we do still, and really encourage people to do, which is to stand up for individual people who are unfairly imprisoned abroad.
And that was, I mean, it's funny, I used to know some senior people at the Observer back in the 1980s, and actually one of the things when they went to their bicentenary that they celebrated was their role in sort of helping create Amnesty, because of course it was a great liberal newspaper, and actually at that point was the most read Sunday newspaper in the world. So you started that, but I remember going, when I started at university, I joined Amnesty in my Freshers' Week, and it was all about that letter writing, and it was an incredibly effective, but actually really interesting, because instead of the abstract of we're going to make human rights better in country X or Y, it was about Mustafa, it was about somebody else that was in trouble, and it became very real. And I think there was something genius about that to start off with, because I think at that time it kind of captured the imagination, and also felt that individuals, as opposed to having my direct debit, I'm doing something very tangible. And do you feel that that sort of direct action piece of those 10 million people that kind of now are around the world that support Amnesty, do you still feel that you've captured that sort of ethos about direct action?
It's a very important part of the ethos. I mean, it's interesting when you talk to people who've been involved in Amnesty for years and years, you know, obviously some cases longer than me. I should say, by the way, Amnesty International globally, including in the UK, by our own statutes, is non-party political. Won't support any political party. We work with people of all sorts of different political colours for things they want to achieve, as long as they're working towards human rights goals. That's what we're trying to get them to achieve. So I met someone who was who was quite a prominent politician, and let's just say I wouldn't necessarily think they were the most favourable towards positive human rights change, just because of political positions they'd taken. But they said to me, by the way, I've been an Amnesty member since the early 70s, so I was slightly surprised when they said it, but said thank you. And they said, well, you know, I joined at university because I thought if I joined the Amnesty Club, I might meet a girlfriend. Right. So, you know, I said,
not necessarily part of your bylaws.
Exactly. We've all got different motivations, but I didn't ask whether or not we delivered on that particular aim in their case. But actually, yes, you know, whether it's university, whether it's people who weren't way back when were writing letters, or today, I should say, actually in the UK, about every year in the UK, around 400,000 or so people get involved in Amnesty's campaigns. And some of those people are still writing a letter by hand, but clearly in 2024, a number of them are getting involved in digital actions, as well as sometimes turning up physically to things that we're doing. So it's around 400,000 or so people, and funny enough, when I said we're non-party political, I do occasionally like to remind people of all sorts of political persuasions at the top of government and the opposition that that's a larger number than gets involved in any of the political parties. So just a kind of reminder when people say, oh, there's no one in the UK who cares about human rights. Actually, we know from opinion polling that that's not true across the whole population. Many people do, but even who are willing to get involved, it's a bigger number than lots of different things. I think the essence for us is that it's critically important that when we are saying that there is a human rights crisis, or any country around the world is not fulfilling its duties according to some of those conventions or treaties around relevant human rights areas, that's often based on deep analysis that we have conducted, whether that's literally from the very scratch, as in looking at photographic evidence, videographic evidence, witness testimony of what's happened, but then the analysis against that, against the law, etc. But alongside that, if you're going to try and make change happen, that can be as right as you like, but if there's a belief amongst decision makers that no one really cares, perhaps your evidence won't be that compelling for them to act upon. Hopefully within what we're doing, and with those 400,000 people in the UK, 10 million people around the world who are very directly involved in Amnesty, they're more involved in the campaigns, by the way, around the world. That 10 million is people who are sort of members and supporters directly, that becomes important because it's much harder for people who have authority and power to say, well, you know, that might be right, but the truth is no one cares. It's still not easy, I have to say. It's still not easy. And sometimes you see, whether it's here in the UK or around the world, people who have decision-making power who want to kind of go, well, you know, I believe in human rights in this situation, but I don't believe in it over here. You know, amazes me. It certainly doesn't stop surprising me, but maybe I mean amazes me as in it's so terrible. The number of people, quite senior levels of decision making, who will talk about the universality of human rights, and then somehow, if the word refugee or asylum seeker is attached, that person has stopped being a human being in their mind. Which, by the way, I'd have to say is not necessarily what the whole country thinks, despite what some of those politicians try and tell you. So, you know, being able to really show them why that's wrong legally, why that's wrong evidentially, but actually why people care about it, is quite an important part of what can make change happen. Whether that change is fighting for something good, or sometimes the change is fighting against something repressive, I'm afraid to say.
How did Amnesty navigate the challenges around it's a nice Western liberal, it's a bunch of Swedes and Brits and Irish people writing about outrages in other places around the world, to that kind of more, you know, as you say, 70 different countries, each at various degrees of openness. How do you manage that? How do you kind of look at those places and say, okay, how do you decide to have a campaign against country X, and the people in that country go, well, hang on, let us be. So how do you navigate that kind of federality?
It's a really excellent question, and the answer is, I think it's evolved the way we do that, and you have to actually be quite reflective and recognise that there certainly have been times when, even if well-intentioned, you can look back at the history of Amnesty, but I came from the international aid sector, you could say same thing there, and that there were things that you were doing that were well-intentioned, but actually with hindsight you look back and you say that was quite colonial, in certainly in its expression, but actually sometimes even in its effect. If you're not willing to look back and recognise that, you're going to actually just keep doing it. The way that Amnesty works now is that we are, as I say, we're very evidential on our human rights positions, and if you look at just one of our publications, it's one of many publications we produce every year, but it's one of the landmark ones. It's the Global Annual Human Rights Report, and you'll see within that we're talking about every single country in the world, and we're talking about that in each case against all of the applicable standards that apply to all of them in a very even-handed way. You're right that what we then do is not necessarily try and campaign at exactly the same volume in exactly the same way on everything. It would just be impossible. Even at Amnesty scale, that would be impossible. So we're always trying to work out what can have the greatest impact. So, for example, here in the UK, even if the last couple of years have perhaps seen some further kind of knocks to UK influence around the world, we're still sitting here in the UK, in a country that's a permanent member of the UN Security Council, perhaps by dint of history. The UK being a centre of English language media can have quite a lot of influence around the world. We probably here in Amnesty UK talk in greater depth and greater volume about some of the things that are happening around the world that Amnesty's working on than perhaps some of my other sister Amnesty organisations will do, because we have learned that that can have a greater influence on some of the things happening around the world in a positive way, and it's very welcomed by my Amnesty colleagues in those different places in the world. So it's not happening at them, it's happening with them. But you know, having said that, you know, you've still got to always be open to how you really make sure that you are expressing things in the ways that are centering the rights of the rights holder. I would say that, by the way, applies not just on all of our work around the world, but also applies domestically. So there are big areas of what flows from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in particular the subsequent treaties, conventions that flow from it. The area that if you work in the area, the jargon is economic, social and cultural rights. Typically, actually, I like to describe those as everyday rights. What we're talking about here are the rights that relate to areas like housing, the rights that relate to areas like actually having the ability to live with sufficient income and be able to eat food that doesn't mean you are starving, even here in the UK. And even domestically, you could fall into the same kind of traps that I think you're talking about, how did Amnesty learn from history? You could just sit in an ivory tower and say, well, what I will do is somehow be expert about someone else's rights. Actually, if you're going to work in those rights areas as an organisation, you need to work really closely with the rights holders involved, because what you are otherwise in danger of doing, even if you're well-intentioned, is coming up with alleged solutions that don't really solve the day-to-day problems that people are talking about. I am fortunate enough to not live in a house, a flat that has black mould, but there are a hell of a lot of people in this city and other cities and outside of cities in the UK that do. If we aren't working directly with those rights holders who are facing those kind of issues and talking about what they do and don't actually want the people responsible for that housing to deliver in terms of solving that problem, we would be in danger of not just patronising those people, but frankly not solving the problem in the way that it needs to be solved. So you have to really challenge yourself and I guess work in the ways of 2024 and beyond, both domestically, but then also on the global issues that we work on. But I'd be the first to say, I don't think Amnesty has always got that right through its history, and certainly if you look back over the years, you think, oh well, we wouldn't talk about that issue somewhere else in the world now in the way that we did in 1963 or 1973 or even 1983 or 2003 or 2013. But obviously you don't have a time machine to change it. What you can do is say, let's think about the right way to do that now and looking forward.
So if you've got some of the examples of some of the really bad guys, former President Assad of Syria, I'm assuming you didn't have a branch in Syria in the last few years.
We did a lot of work on issues in relating to Syria, but no, the Assad regime was never keen to have a vibrant Amnesty branch in its country.
Strange that, that it comes as a thing. But did he care? When you highlighted it, the mass murder that he committed, the massive human rights infringements, the prisons, all of this stuff, do you think he got up in the morning and actually said, oh, Amnesty, that's Sacha in London, he's upset me no end, send a hit squad?
He certainly didn't, and obviously sadly he's not alone around the world. He certainly didn't wake up every morning and think, I was so glad for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and how do I make sure that we're really trying to bring that, to live that to the best? I mean, obviously he didn't, Bashar Assad or his father before him were far from alone in the world. That's not the way that they wake up every morning. Whether it's moving away just from that one particular country, but let's just take the question that it sits part of, which is governments that in some way have an autocratic approach, whatever their structure may be, whether they're highly personalised around a single person or whether they're actually more of a sort of party and institutional structure, because you see both and a whole range in between. Do they, in the same way that on one end of a spectrum, do they jump out of bed every morning and say, how do I bring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? If the other end of the spectrum is they don't care in the slightest whether the international institutions or courts or frankly the court of public opinion is very clear about their violations, actually that's not true either. That's not true either. Their life is a space in between those two things, where what we as Amnesty, and not just ourselves, there are other great human rights institutions with whom we work alongside. Some institutions are within structures like the UN structures, others are other NGOs. That space in between is about maximising the kind of places that get that influence to cut through, and frankly sometimes put barriers in the way of those kind of behaviours. Yes, I'm as frustrated as anyone that perhaps over its history, we haven't seen the International Criminal Court be as fast as some might like in its issuing of arrest warrants, in its prosecutions. But it would be a nonsense to say that people who are violating human rights do not believe that the ICC matters, do not believe that other forms of criminal sanction matter, do not believe that if their countries are sanctioned by the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, which will deal with countries rather than people, that matters. You're absolutely right. Many countries have signed up to treaties, have signed up to conventions, and then not wanted to live by those conventions. It's quite interesting if you look back, again, I know this is only one example, but if you look back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, President Havel, at the time of Czechoslovakia, obviously then later the Czech Republic after the split in the country, drew a direct line between the Soviet Union and other states signing the Helsinki declarations and the ability of campaigners, under a lot of pressure initially, obviously, although ultimately successful in those countries, to use the tools of the commitments that had been made to point out the hypocrisy between those commitments and realities. So even in the kind of toughest situations, I think people find governments struggle when there's egregious evidence of that kind of gap. Clearly, the more that is enforced by international institutions, by other governments supporting those institutions, then the stronger that pressure can be, or the stronger the policing of that can be.
Do you ever worry when you're about to launch an individual or a group campaign of, oh dear, could we end up making things worse?
It's a very, very good question. In relation to any individual situation that Amnesty is working on, the most important thing to say is we don't do anything without working closely with either the person in question, if you can have any contact with them, or obviously very often it's their family. So it's an absolute rule. Of course, even then, what you are constantly thinking is, I suppose, a principle which should be probably best labelled as do no harm. Of course, that should be a principle, that doesn't mean that you are compromising on what you're calling for, but you're absolutely trying to make sure that what you're calling for, and the way in which you're campaigning could not inadvertently damage the person in question. The biggest way in which that's important is obviously the accuracy of what you're saying, and there have been situations, not conducted by Amnesty but by others, where in the past someone who thought they were well-meaning said something about a particular individual abroad and was inaccurate about what that person had been doing in that particular country, and that actually then got used by the country in question. So the key thing, though, is not only would you want to avoid that in the abstract, but we'd always be working with either the individual in question, if you can have any contact with them at all, or with their family, and then obviously solicitors and others if they're involved. The same approach applies to the broader systemic questions, or the questions of a country's behaviour. But again, in some ways, if you're talking about the actions of a whole country, then the application of that approach perhaps would be about making sure that when we are publishing evidence, that our evidence is often very carefully peer-reviewed, etc. But in terms of the publication, obviously you've got to be very clear that what couldn't happen is that someone could then try and use the evidence that we've published to seek out and persecute one of the witnesses, for example. So we're always thinking about that. What we wouldn't do, because this isn't our remit, and it's certainly not our approach, is say we would compromise on publishing human rights evidence if we had it, or somehow be softer over here because maybe that will get a country to change more. As soon as you get into that, it's a slippery slope. For a start, I'm sure one person would say you should campaign more hard, and another person would say you should campaign more soft. But the truth is, we have to be evidence-based, and we have to apply the same standards to every country in the same way. Because if you don't do that, you would be open to a legitimate criticism that you're somehow making a political choice or a culturally biased choice, or whatever it might be.
Can you think back to the time of Amnesty, some of the triumphs of where you think, well, actually we really made a difference in that case, or that country, or we helped move the dial.
So, I mean, over the years, there've been numerous cases of individuals imprisoned where obviously, in sometimes when we're running the letter writing campaigns, or as they are now, they're a combination of the physical letter and the emails, etc. campaigns. To some extent, you sometimes don't know what the person who's in prison knows, or what's reaching them. But over the decades since, we've heard numerous cases where people have said, people who are in prison who were actually receiving those cards and those letters and those messages, and even saying, they had prison governors going, here's another 1,000 letters for you, and it mattered hugely to them that they weren't forgotten, and we can draw the line to their particular release. There've also been more systemic changes as well, whether that's areas about on an international level, in international law about trade in arms, whether that's again areas in international law, international treaties, etc., about the role of torture and its prevention, whether it's a big thing, and again this in a way is more country by country, but over the years we've seen a huge shift in the number of countries that allow the death penalty, and Amnesty and others, first to say it's never us just solo, but Amnesty and others many of those countries were really at the forefront of anti-death penalty campaigning. And again, even if you're to say, look back on the most recent year, Ghana was an example where there was, the removal of the death penalty as a sentence was very recent. So even though that shift has happened over decades in many, many countries, it's not something that's by any means over, including obviously in the United States. What I would also though say is, there are times when it can be, you have to, however much you've had that sort of progress, you can see things, particularly where there's a kind of overlap of quite of anti-rights being used as a movement, sometimes a kind of populist message. Yeah. You can see a real counter to that. I'm horrified by the and not just me, Amnesty is horrified by the way in which we've seen a growth over the last few decades of issues that are solely a healthcare issue in our point of view, and a healthcare issue for women that have somehow been turned into a weapon of the anti-rights movement. And again, just to sort of stop that being only an abstract point, we've seen that even in the UK when we talk about the right to an abortion, which I'm not sure if people who are in this room or people who are watching this online live or recorded will know that even until very, very recently, and I'm only talking a couple of years, the right to an abortion, the right to an element of healthcare, obviously for women, was something that did not exist as a right in law in one of the 4 countries in the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland. And even then, when the change in law had to be pushed through, we saw a massive, massive, massive gap of that actually turning into any form of practice, which, by the way, is far from kind of smooth or true even today. So that's just one example, I think, of, yes, there are absolutely big kind of anti-rights movements, but alongside that, let's look at another area of campaigning I was involved in before Amnesty, actually. I was very involved in the campaigns for the introduction of civil partnership and then marriage equality here in the UK. And just in the last year, we've seen same-sex marriage introduced in Greece, which is obviously fantastic development, and one where lots of campaigners and indeed politicians kind of stood up firmly, and it was perhaps a place where there was more of a religious and cultural and political overlap, so it wasn't necessarily expected. We've seen the Supreme Court in Japan rule against the lack of same-sex marriage provision in Japan, albeit we haven't yet seen the legislation to turn that round. So, there are different wins in different places. Over decades, we've seen a number of kind of big shifts. What I would say is that we are certainly at a moment where I think populist forces in different places are trying to grab anti-rights agendas and really say to people, your rights depend on you taking these rights away from someone else. History has shown that that's a totally false narrative. Right? It's a totally false narrative, but it's sadly a well-trodden narrative right through history, and we're seeing it again.
So if you look at the world today, 75 years on, there is a sense that things are getting darker. You've got huge challenges in the Middle East, you've got the war in Ukraine, you've got lots of forest fires going on all around the world. Are you optimistic, pessimistic? Where do you sit at the moment and when you look at the world?
So, I mean, me personally, I'm very fortunate to be doing something I love, and it's certainly not to say that things that either I'm working on personally in terms of human rights situations or my many colleagues in Amnesty, they're all knotty, and by definition, you are looking at something which, on a personal level, you're looking at things that horrify you frequently. But despite that, I'm going to say actually I'm quite a hopeful person. Even take some of the things that are very live at the moment. I'm frequently talking about the need for the International Criminal Court to be looking at particular things, or the need for a country like the UK to be supporting the role of that court, or supporting the role of the ICJ, or properly enforcing our duties by different conventions. When I step back, even if I'm saying this country needs to do more, I remind myself that I'm talking about levers that 70 or so years ago didn't exist. We wouldn't have had the institutions or the principles or the principles brought into those treaties on which to anchor what we're talking about. I think I don't want to give anyone a sense that isn't also true, that certainly perhaps in the period since the end of the Cold War, the late 80s, early 90s, I think many people, myself and Amnesty included, think that some of those approaches, institutions that were created after that moment, they're under greater threat now than they have been for decades. Some of that threat, ironically, comes from when there are countries that strongly supported their creation that somehow now seem to either be sort of weaker or rowing back on their support, or perhaps saying, well, I liked them when they were dealing with that because, I didn't like that country, or I don't like them when they're dealing with one of my allies. The principle actually has to be you've got to allow the institution and the law to apply even-handedly. So, you can't kind of ask them to only look at one situation and not another. Here in the UK, I would certainly say that one of the things that the UK government was elected this summer, has said very, very forcefully is that they want to re-establish the position and respect for the UK globally as a leader in supporting the rule of law, a leader in supporting the principles of the application of international law and international human rights principles within that. And to be fair to them, I'd say in a number of areas they have taken strong steps forward from perhaps what we saw in the last few years. Maybe you could argue that was because what we saw in the last few years was so poor, or so sort of threw away some of the aspects of UK respect and leadership, so it was kind of low starting point. But it would be churlish not to recognise that, even though I think in some other areas, if that's what they really believe and want to practice, they need to go a bit farther, or perhaps sometimes struggle with it a little bit in some situations more than they do in others. So I guess all of that means, as we're looking into 2025, it's an extraordinarily febrile world. It's extraordinarily febrile domestically. Again, we have, I think, I've certainly just used one area of rights as an example. Do I look at next year and think that there will continue to be flagrant violations of the rights of refugees and asylum seekers here in the UK and abroad? Absolutely. Do I look at 2025 and think that there are major approaches here in the UK, such as the government's Prevent Anti-Terrorism programme, that is ill thought through, not very effective, and actually quite racist in the way that it practices? Absolutely I do. Do I look at certain things that are developing, like a greater use of predictive policing, AI in certain areas, and think actually, even if some people are thinking of those with good aims, are they perhaps not realising that if you implement them in certain ways or design them in certain ways, that they can actually restrict the rights of some people or bias in their benefits to certain communities of others. Of course, all of that is happening as well as the big geopolitics of it. Maybe I come back to thinking if you've got 400,000 people a year actively involved in campaigning on that in the UK, just in Amnesty, let alone people who are campaigning on human rights that I don't even see it, that you shouldn't be entirely pessimistic about whether they're people who really care and want to kind of get to the depth of supporting and making change happen.
Well, I think that's actually a wonderful way to end. Not entirely pessimistic or cautiously optimistic, I'll possibly rephrase. Certainly here in the UK, I think there's the Foreign Secretary is a City Lit Fellow, we're delighted to say. So we have our little part in that world. And for us, it's great that we've got this partnership with Amnesty. I love the way that you made what is actually a very complicated situation in the world quite understandable. And I certainly have a better grip on the ideas of how the United Nations Convention started and the work that Amnesty does. So for those of you who are online, thank you for joining us, and for those of you in the room, thank you for being here, and very much thank you, Sacha, for giving us the time and also the partnership with Amnesty.
Thank you.